večer, mé jméno je Myersonová, jsem manažerkou Czechdesignu a dovolte mi, abych vás přivítala na další přednášce z našeho cyklu Budoucnost designu, který pořádáme díky podpoře finančních mechanismů EHP, který tímto velmi děkujeme. Minule jsme se tady sešli u příležitosti přednášky na téma sociální design. Dnes v tom tématu pokračujeme přednáškou, která se jmenuje Design pro lidské potřeby, kterou si pro nás připravil emeritní ředitel Helen Hamlyn Centre v Londýně, což je vlastně, tak jak já to chápu, z informací, které jsem si při přípravě této přednášky připravila, procházela, jako takový inkubátor, který se stará o přesah a spolupráci Royal College of Art s praxí, ať už ji zastupuje soukromý nebo veřejnoprávní sektor. Přednášku si pro nás připravil pan Jeremyho Myersona, kterého tímto vítám. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation. And now over to you for your presentation. Thank you very much.
Okay, dobrý večer. That's my last word of Czech this evening. So my lecture will be in English, and it's a great pleasure to be here. And my message this evening, as part of this series on the future of design, is that the future, I'm going to try and persuade you that the future of European design is actually inclusive design. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the principles of inclusive design, the history, the role of my own research centre in developing inclusive design principles, and also I'm going to end by showing you some of our projects, our larger projects. Now, I'm a great believer in user-led design thinking. So do people want the light on or the light off? Show of hands. Who would like to keep the light on? Okay. Who would like the light off? Oh, I think the light stays on just about. Okay. This is not my first visit to Prague. I've been a number of times. The first time I came was in 1982 and 1983. Hi. This is what Czech design looked like at the time. I was a guest of the Czechoslovak Design Council. I was working for the British Design Council. It's interesting. We now have Czech Design, which is an NGO, and the British Design Council is also an NGO. And things were very, very different. When I arrived at the airport in 1982, there was no Hugo Boss or Burberry, I can guarantee that. There was a castle and there was a Franz Kafka house, but there were no Prada stores in Prague. I come from the Royal College of Art. I know you've just had your as an academy, you've just had your 130th birthday. We're a little older, and I think the academy in Prague was based on the Royal College of Art. We're very similar, an independent academy of architecture, art and design. We're entirely postgraduate, and in 2012 we had our 175th anniversary. The Royal College of Art was founded it was called the Government School of Design, and it was because the British government were very worried about Prussian imports. Nothing has changed in 175 years. And it's quite interesting. People can trace our interest in design back to this event. This is the funeral carriage of the Duke of Wellington, who was a British military hero in 1852. And students from the Royal College of Art were invited to design the carriage. And the novelist Charles Dickens at the time said it was the most garish, horrible thing he'd ever seen in his life. And as the carriage passed down central London, the wheels literally came off the wagon and the Grand Duke's body slithered into the road. And it was at that point where the governors of the college decided they needed engineers alongside decorative artists to make things work. And this scene is the beginning of design at the Royal College of Art. And I want to take you on a little journey, again, starting with war, on a history of inclusive design, because the Royal College of Art has had a long engagement with it. And the story starts at the end of the Second World War. We know that Europe was divided. There was a Soviet bloc in which Czechoslovakia was part. There was Western Europe. There was massive damage. And there was a process of reconstructing Europe. But importantly, there was a recalibration of social and political ideals. A lot of the old ideology was swept away. And the idea of social inclusion, of democracy, of equality of rights, of all of these ideas were very, very current. 3 years after the end of the war in Britain, there was a very famous neurologist called Sir Ludwig Guttmann, who decided that people who'd been very badly injured during the war were not vegetables. They didn't lie in beds all day. He got them up doing sports in wheelchairs. And this was the beginning of the Paralympic Games. We've just had in London in 2012 one of the best, most exciting Paralympic Games we've ever had. So this was the start in 1948 of treating disability in a different way, understanding that disabled people had rights. The next big landmark in the story of inclusive design concerned an American designer called Henry Dreyfuss. Now, he designed Polaroid cameras and John Deere tractors, and he wrote a book in 1955 called Designing with People, in which he invented something called anthropometrics. And he went on in 1960 to develop this language of anthropometrics. And it was a tipping point. This was the backlash against what he did was really the beginning of inclusive design. Because what Dreyfuss did was he went out and he measured the reach, the hands, the head size, the weight, the girth of thousands of American men, women and children. There was Joe, there was Josephine, and there was Joe Jr. There was no Josephine Jr., because obviously little girls didn't exist in America in the 1950s. And he aggregated all the scores and he divided them by the number of people he'd measured. And he came up with average types. This is why you have the term average Joe. It's all based on his work on anthropometrics. So the American industrial design industry started developing books of anthropometric data based on average types. And we all know that people are not average. You're different from you, you're different from you. Nobody's the same. And the idea of creating data for designers that would enable you, well, this is how wide a corridor should be, you know, based on average types. This is how wide an airline seat should be. And it was a very dangerous thing, anthropometrics, because it reduced the diversity of humankind to a series of metrics of average types. And very quickly, there was a backlash. The first notable backlash was by a British architect called Selwyn Goldsmith in 1963. And he wrote a book called Designing the Disabled, The New Paradigm, in which he said, hang on, there are people in wheelchairs. At the same time, in the States, a very, very important aspect of the inclusive design movements was, this is Martin Luther King, and the Civil Rights Act was signed in 1964, which gave blacks in America equal rights. And this became a blueprint for a struggle by other marginalised groups. If you remember, Rosa Parks just died very recently. It all began 9 years earlier, in 1955, when Rosa Parks got on a bus, a segregated bus, and there was the bus boycott in the States. And this led to the black civil rights movement. And it ended up a blueprint for the disability and age discrimination rights movements. And then there was the impact of the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was very interesting. It was the first modern war in which the Americans perfected the art of dropping helicopters into the battle zone to scoop up the wounded. So people who would have bled to death, and did in the Second World War, because they had no form of getting them out, people survived having lost limbs. And suddenly in America there was a whole group of disabled veterans who went back to the States and found they were excluded from jobs, from homes, from the built environment, and they became very strong voices for social inclusion. And the disability rights movement mirrored the civil rights movement. And it led eventually, and you can see in the photograph, a man called Ron Kovac on the left. And he was played in the film Born on the 4th of July. He was played by Tom Cruise in a film depiction of his life. And eventually, in 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed, a very major piece of legislation, which was then copied by the European Union, and you probably have similar legislation in place in this country. And in Britain, 6 years later, we developed the same thing. Other things were going on. If there are any students in the audience, if there are, if you read one English language design book on your studies, read this one. 1971, Design for the Real World, by Victor Papanek, in which Papanek challenged American industrial design. He said it was all market-driven, it was all for business. It was so incendiary, his text, that he couldn't find an English language publisher. It had to be published in Swedish in 1971. Eventually, a British publisher published it in 1972. And it challenges the market-led perception of design. It says, what about older people? What about disabled people? What about the developing world? What about ecology? What about children? Everybody has rights, and design has really been aimed at young, fit men based on the data of anthropometrics. And Papanek, and I met Papanek, absolutely fascinating character. Other highlights from the inclusive design movement, and this is very important. This is an American industrial designer called Patricia Moore, Patty Moore. And between 1979 and 1982, she met a Hollywood makeup artist who'd done the makeup for Dustin Hoffman in the film Tootsie, where Dustin Hoffman dressed as an old woman. And she said, can you disguise me as an old woman? And she was in her 20s. She lived on the streets of New York, Baltimore, Chicago, Toronto, disguised as an old woman. She was beaten up, she was marginalised, she was discriminated against, and then she wrote all her experience up in a book called Disguised. And the book has now been taken up as an option by Renée Zellweger to make a film. And it's a very, very interesting story. But Patty Moore's disguise and really walking a mile in somebody else's shoes, she kind of invented a whole genre of design research called empathy tools, where you bind up you put latex gloves on so you haven't got dexterity. You put Vaseline on your spectacles to simulate glaucoma. You put tape around your knees so you can't walk properly. And suddenly, you've aged 40 years. And then you try and experience the environment. You try and put a key in a lock. You try and go up an escalator. You try and hail a cab. And she realizes it's not just the physical barriers, but there's the social and cultural barriers to aging. And she wrote this shocking book. And in 1982, she was Time Magazine's Woman of the Year. And it really was a wake-up call. In the 1980s, the story of inclusive design begins to come close to the Royal College of Art. The Royal College of Art, like the Academy here in Prague, a traditional school of art, design and architecture, very much about creative self-expression, wonderful practitioners down the years, from David Hockney to Tracy Emin and James Dyson and all kinds of people. In 1986, a graduate of the college called Helen Hamlyn, she curated an exhibition at the Victoria and Albert Museum called New Design for Old. And what she did was she invited 16 of the world's top industrial designers to take an item in the home and redesign it for older people. So an easier shower, a better chair, new furniture. One of the innovations was, it's now standard practice in older people's homes, is when the light goes off, the frame of the light switch glows green. So in the dark you can find where the light is. Common sense. But it was a very, very good exhibition, very groundbreaking at the time. And it led in 1991 to the launch of a programme of design research at the Royal College of Art called Design Age. And this was really looking mainly in the home, but at ways in which designers could do research and come up with practical innovations that would help people, older people, not go into institutional care. And my friend and colleague Roger Coleman was the first director of Design Age. And he, in fact, coined the term inclusive design in a paper at a Toronto conference in 1994. And he said inclusive design was really important because it was about opportunity and equality, and it wasn't about legislation to change people's behaviour, but encouraging business, public sector to get on board with including more people. And out of that whole thing developed the Helen Hamlyn Centre for Design. And I have been its director for the last 16 years. It was launched in 1999, and there's Helen Hamlyn in the centre with the culture minister on the left and the rector of the college on the right. And this was a landmark moment because the Helen Hamlyn Trust put a lot of money into the centre, and we were able to build a whole programme. And we decided that we wouldn't just focus on ageing. Inclusive design, we could see that there were a whole range of targets for designers to think about in terms of social inclusion. It goes back to the Papanek idea. It's not just older people, but young disabled people, people who are excluded by digital technology, technologically excluded, people who are economically excluded, people who are ethnically and culturally excluded, exclusions on the basis of gender. So there's a whole range of opportunities. And we created 3 research labs. The first was our traditional focus on age and the natural deficits of ageing. But 2 other labs which were important. One was about health and patient safety, looking particularly at hospitals and healthcare, and I'll come on to that. And the third was a more architectural lab looking at the workplace and the city, access to the built environment for everybody. And what we decided to do was to create this community of inclusive design researchers. And at a time when the general move in Britain and the States was to get engineers and social scientists and teach them design thinking, we decided that we would go in the opposite direction. We would take graduate designers from the Royal College of Art in a range of disciplines: industrial design, furniture, textiles, vehicle design, architecture, design engineering. And we would teach them the ethnographic method so that they would know just enough to go upstream and talk to people and capture user requirements. And we were swimming against the tide. And it was a really exciting venture, because what we did was we took new graduates every year. We took 10 graduates coming off the postgraduate programs of the RCA. And what we did was we decided to give them a paid post working with a company or a charity or a government department, and they do an inclusive design project lasting a year. And it was really exciting. These are two of my design researchers. On the left is Katie, who's a textile designer, and on the right is Andy, who did industrial design engineering. They worked together. They were working with a charity looking at new homes for autistic adults. And what we were trying to do was to pull together a network of companies, of government departments, of charities, of NGOs, and get these designers working with them on collaborative projects in which there would be a high level of development in terms of design resolution, but an equally high level of front-end research to really understand how people live and do ethnographic study. And we were very much driven by, it's one of my favourite quotes by the pentagram graphic designer Alan Fletcher, with whom I did a book, "Artists solve their own problems, designers solve other people's." What's interesting is that designers now solve their own problems and act as artists, which is fine. I just happen to be more interested in solving other people's. And a big part of our work was to define inclusive design. And we worked with the British government, and we came up with a very, very simple definition for the British government. And we came up with a British standard also for inclusive design. A process whereby designers ensure that their products, environments and services address the needs of the widest possible audience. No mention of age, no mention of disability. Although, of course, the demographic picture was moving very rapidly. But the reason for that definition was very, very simple. We wanted businesses, we wanted companies to be interested in inclusive design. The needs of the widest possible audience. Companies immediately thought, bigger market. These people using design techniques can get closer to the customer, and we can expand our market. We had a lot of companies work with us over the years. In the background, of course, there is this, and I know because I've looked at the data on the Czech Republic, you're a very young and beautiful audience, but you are in a country in which the population is aging. In Britain, the population is aging at speed. These are population pyramids, and you can see how in 1950, people who were older, yes, if you don't like the lecture, throw a dead cat on the table. People in 1950, at the top end of the pyramid, it was a very sharp point, very few of them. Now, it's changed, and by 2050, it will have flattened out. But, there are now more pensioners than there are teenagers in Britain. But that's nothing compared to Japan, where the average age of the population in 1950 was 22, and by 2050 will be 55. A quarter of the Japanese population is now over 65. It's incredible. I have a friend who works for the Building Research Institute in Tokyo, and he says, if you throw a stone in Tokyo, you'll hit a senior, which is quite a good way of explaining that, it's incredible. And yet, design is still associated with youth, with speed, all of those things. Do you know what's the average age of a new car buyer in Europe? Anyone know? Anyone want to guess?
8 years.
Sorry?
8 years.
8? No, 8-year-olds don't buy cars. It's 45. Average age of a new sports car buyer? 55. Older people are ones with the money. This is quite interesting. This is data from across Europe, right across Europe, a sample of 80 million people taken from local area health data. It's not wheelchair users. It's not all about wheelchair users in terms of disability. You know, that's the top bar. It's a relatively small number in terms of the total of Europe. But not walking without aid, just the natural deficiency of aging, you know, over 40 million people. The number of people who are congenitally deaf, there aren't that many. But people who are hard of hearing, there are practically 80 million people. So it's the minor multiple impairments of aging that make problems with products and services and all of that. And so these are the things that designers are increasingly having to look at. Hearing and vision, because as we get older, these are affected. Motion, locomotion, reach, stretch and dexterity. And cognition, communication and intellectual functioning. The rise of autism, the rise of dementia across Europe. So we have a world in which Europe is an old continent. We are aging rapidly, and designers have traditionally looked just at young people. And that's going to change. There's going to be huge opportunities for new products and services because people are living in different ways. A lot of older people are living alone. I found this data quite interesting. The Czech Republic has one of the highest levels of older people living alone. When you're over 65, there's a good chance you will be living in a one-person household, which has different services. And women are much more likely, that you're the orange, much more likely to be living alone than men. And there's all kinds of new types of patterns of living for which we need to design. And our model of aging as designers and creatives, our model of aging, and this is something that the Helen Hamlyn Centre we've been very, very interested in developing. So how is the model changing? The traditional medical model of aging is a medical model based around aging being some kind of disease. It's about decrepitude, it's about dependency, and it's ultimately about death. That's what aging is, if you look at it medically. It's the road to death and dependency and decrepitude. What if you looked at aging as, in a different way, the social model, the third age, and I'm sure you've heard that term, the age of finishing one life, maybe full-time employment, but having new hobbies, having new friends, having new social networks, having time to look after your grandchildren, having time to take up new careers. There's a lot of silver entrepreneurs. So a social model of aging would make it all sound very different. And then there's a cultural model of aging, that not only is this a connected, active period of your life, the third age, it's also culturally unique and worth examining. I'm fascinated why, Dion have, there are various fashion houses in Paris who are using much older women now as their... Joni Mitchell is the face of one of the French houses. I think it's Givenchy, even though she's 70. People are very interested in aging as a cultural phenomenon because the new old are not like the old. The new boomers who are becoming in their 70s and 80s, they're much more experiential. They're the ones with the money. And they're the ones with the education. And it's very, very interesting how our approach to aging is changing. So this is the background against which we've been working as a group, where the Helen Hamlyn Centre is about 36 researchers. And we call this the five E's, because these are what we think are the key values that are really important in design, and they're not the traditional values of design. They're empathy. Can you walk a mile in someone else's shoes? Can you step out of your own concerns and empathize with somebody else? And it's not about design looking neutrally and scientifically at somebody, maybe watching a focus group through one of those mirrored windows, whereas you can see them and they can't see you. That's terrible. It's being in the room with the person and engaging with them. And I know that some of you are going to do a workshop with me tomorrow, and you're going to be meeting some people who are going to help you inform the design. You're going to do a project during the day, and empathy will be required to try and understand other people's lives. And in order to understand other people's lives, you need an ethnographic approach. You need to understand how you pull information together. And I know that a lot of designers get very worried about research, ethnographic research. You know, this is what the geeks did at school, where we were really good at making and drawing and building. Actually, ethnographic research is a creative act, and you design your ethnographic encounter in the same way that you would design an artifact or an image. And ethnography is very important. Equally, and this is why I think designers make such fantastic researchers, you need to experiment. And designers have got that ability. You can make stuff. You can make a rough prototype and show it to somebody and say, hey, what do you think? Sit on that chair, you know, hang on to that bar, look through those spectacles. Because you can make things. You can do probes and provocations and drawings. You can visually express things. And this is a very important thing, and experimentation is huge. And then there's evidence and evaluation. Don't be afraid to put your ideas to the test. You know, just because you like it doesn't mean it's right. You know, if you're designing for other people, you've got to evaluate it and look at evidence and see what other people have done. And so this is incredibly important. So we have some key rules in our research centre. The first one is, and it's interesting because there's a history of designers doing things for people, often with the best intentions, but design for the real world, designing for the disabled, all those books I showed you. Actually, we think it's not about designing for people, it's about designing with people. And we have our own website with a lot of methods and activities which you may well want to look at, because it has lots of cases, and we're going to be looking at it tomorrow in the workshop. So this is not for but with. This is not treating people as passive consumers. You know, inclusive design is designing things that people want rather than getting people to want things. It's not also treating people as passive victims, you know, who can't look after themselves. I find older and disabled people are incredibly vocal about their own needs and very aware of the limitations and how the world works. So we work very closely with people. This is a group of clinicians and hospital managers who are actually at the RCA designing themselves a new system, a new process for how pharmaceuticals move through a hospital. So this is far away from the auteur, the artist, the single visionary who makes the thing, which is absolutely fine. But this is at the other end. This is interdisciplinary research in which the designer is acting as facilitator and artistic entrepreneur, if you like, encouraging innovation in others. So designing with, as opposed to designing for, is a key principle. Another big principle we have is the problem comes first. And this is quite unfashionable, the problematic. But we think that in any process, you should spend at least half the project trying to worry about the problem you're trying to solve and understand the problem as coming up with a solution. What designers love to do, they get some scant information And they're so keen to get into the creative delivery process that they don't slow down and think about the problem. So we split all our projects into 4 phases, and this methodology has been enshrined by the British Design Council. We start with a discovery phase, a deep dive, in which your thinking becomes incredibly divergent. And then we try and draw some conclusions from that. We try and define what we've learned through observation, through interviews, through ethnographic encounters, through precedent study, and so on and so forth. And therefore we define the problem and we become convergent in our thinking. And then we think, well, right, okay, now we've worked out what the problem is, we can now come up with a creative solution. And that's when you become divergent again. There are lots of different ways to skin a cat, wherever that cat is. You become divergent, lots of ideas. And finally, you become convergent when you come in on the design system or process or solution or artifact. And I was very influenced by a Danish exhibition that came to London and also went to Paris to the Pompidou, called Design, the Problem Comes First. It was by a man called Jens Berntsen, who is sadly no longer with us. And he was using this as a framework to describe why so many Danish products, from Lego to Bang & Olufsen and Louis Poulsen lights, were so effective in the marketplace. And my favourite story is about Velux. So Velux, do you have Velux in the Czech Republic? Yeah. I assume you did, but just in case. In the 1920s and 30s, people were trying to make loft rooms habitable, sleeping underneath the roof line. And there were lots of patents, there were lots of ways in which you could cut a hole in the roof, put a pane of glass there. Lots of people were inventing lots of ways to do it. They all thought the problem in a loft room is light. You've got to get, it's dark up there, you've got to get light in there. But if you've ever been in a loft room on a very hot day, you know how hot it is. It's not light, it's air. Light is secondary. Yes, you need light, but you need air. So you need a window that opens. And it was Velux who understood that. They filed a patent for a revolutionary hinge, and they are a small Danish company who are market leaders in the world, because the problem came first and they solved it. We're very, very interested in solving the right problem. You can be as creative as you like, and I see lots of design solving the wrong problems. Another of our principles is to check out the positives, the assets that are available to you, rather than the negatives. So there's an English expression called glass half full or glass half empty. And we try to have the glass half full. And we're very interested in something called asset mapping, which is an American process. So if you go into a community and you're looking and you see a boarded up old house and covered in graffiti, and you think, that's terrible. And then you see a load of kids smoking dope on a wall with hoodies on, and you go, ooh, they're a bit of a problem. Or you go into a community and you see a boarded up house and you think, that could be a youth centre, we could clean that place up. I bet we get it really cheap. You see a load of kids on the wall, great people we can mobilise to do this. It's a different way of thinking. And it's an American thing called asset mapping. We're going to try a bit of it tomorrow. And this is about, and assets can be spaces or groups or people or infrastructure or media. And what you have is an asset map that the closer to the centre, the more powerful the asset. And you get a community or a group of office workers it can be, or it can be a neighbourhood group, and you get them to talk about the assets and name them and move them around the board until you see what you've got to build on. So, glass half full, map the positives, map the assets. We're also interested in, I've talked about ethnographic encounters, and as part of that, experimentation is really important. James Dyson, who's an alumnus of the Royal College of Art and employs a lot of Royal College of Art graduates. He had 500 prototypes which failed before he made a dual cyclone vacuum cleaner. And I was reading recently about Thomas Edison and the tungsten halogen light bulb. It took him 1,000 different goes until he found a material that would burn properly to make the original tungsten halogen light bulb. And he wrote, he said, I have not failed. I have successfully found 1,000 materials which do not work. And I think you should bear that in mind. Keep going with experimentation. And one of probably the poster boy of OXO Good Grips is, this is, have you ever seen these? So this is kitchen tools made by an American company called OXO, and they were originally designed for people with severe arthritis, and it uses a new rubber called neoprene, which is wonderfully for people with limited dexterity. It's fantastically malleable in the hand and enables you to do this. And what's really exciting about this is it was based on simple ethnography of watching people with arthritis trying to peel potatoes. And then it was based on ethnography, on experiment with different materials till they came up with the right one. And it's a fantastic market leader. And this idea of multiple iteration, be divergent, come up with lots of different ideas. This was a project called Tongue Sucker. Please don't put Tongue Sucker into Google. We had to change the name of it. But this is to stop people swallowing their own tongues when they have an emergency. We came up with hundreds of different ways to solve the problem. And we've done a lot of medical products where we do multiple iterations and lots of user testing. This is a neck brace for people who have had spinal injuries. This is the final design, based on simply trial and error, working with different materials and mechanisms and fixings. A lot of neck braces on the market actually don't hold the neck stable, and we were working with paramedics to make this happen. So just a few of the principles that are so important to us. Designing with people. The problem comes first. And critically, experimentation and this whole idea of ethnographic encounter, really walking a mile in somebody else's shoes, solving somebody else's problems. So, having given you a flavour of the centre and a bit of a history of inclusive design, I'd like, in this concluding section, I'd like to show you 3 case studies. I've deliberately made them about London because I thought you'd find it interesting. And it's where design kind of hits quite complex systems. These are not easy problems to solve. Some of our projects are quite short and done by one person. These are multiple, these are slightly bigger projects. But they address some of the values that we hold dear around empathy, ethnography, evaluation, and so on. So the first project is around safer streets. And I know, just from being in Prague today, you're having a big debate about the future of your streets. Because I gather you can't cycle in this city without getting killed. And it's not so easy to walk, although it's very walkable in some cases. We have a big change in the UK on the way in how we design our streets. For the last 60, 70 years, the motor car has had control of our streets. Everything is designed around the vehicle. You know, occasionally the pedestrian is allowed to cross. You know, cyclists, take to the streets, at their peril. It's very, very difficult. But this is a new concept called shared space. And this is by the Victoria and Albert Museum in South Kensington. And this one is in Brighton. The idea is that you remove the road markings. You remove the curbs, you remove the railings. And cars must share the space equally with cyclists and pedestrians. And what could be more democratic and inclusive than that on the surface? You know, nobody has control. It's a bit like a supermarket car park where people have got trolleys of food and everyone's trying to negotiate with each other as they get out of the car park. No one's got right of way. And you've got to negotiate. And of course it's meant to calm the traffic right down. It's based on a Dutch traffic engineering concept. From a northern Dutch town, I've forgotten the name of the engineer who devised it, but probably that northern Dutch town's got about 7 cars in it. It's not like central London. The big problem is that what if you are older or disabled? What if you don't have very good sight? You really do need, you rely on the railings, you rely on the curbs, you rely on the demarcation between where it's safe to walk and where the cars are going to go. And there's been a huge outpouring of anger in London over the introduction of shared space. There have been, say no to shared space. All the sight loss charities have organised days there. They've boycotted politicians. There's been high court actions. And we were brought in by the British government who said, you know, everyone says this new concept is democratic and it creates more convivial streets and it's inclusive. Why are these people kicking off? Why are they shouting and screaming? So we did what we do. This is Ross Atkin, one of our research associates, a graduate of the RCA, and he was examining the streets, taking photographs, talking to people. He spent a day, this goes back to the Patty Moore work, walking around London with a long cane, with a mask, so he had very little vision. He then recruited a user group of people with different types of sight loss. So this is a typical, what we call a research map. So we tend to do qualitative research in depth with between 8 and 10 people. So we want a gender balance, 4 men, 4 women, and we want this is quite a good map because the dots are all over the map. So we've got a mix of male and female, and we've got a mix of a range of visual impairment, and we've got from urban to suburban. If I was critical of the map, the women all seem to be more urban and the men all seem to be more suburban. So it's not quite a good mix, but and we followed people on walks that they make and looking at how they navigated their environment. And we collected video and audio evidence, and we used GPS to take lots of photographs. And we examined the streetscape. And out of it, we came up, and it's amazing in London how different streets are designed in different ways. So you're getting different messages. And we designed so a sighted street user, like most of you, you would rely on your sight, a bit of memory, and a bit of sound. But somebody who is blind will rely on the tactile paving, the curb line, and the railings. So here, at 1 metre, you and I are relying on sight and sound. They're relying on the railings and the curb line. Take the railings and the curb line away, this is why everyone's upset. So we did all these resource maps, we produced a document for the government, and then we went on, because we don't just do guidelines, we developed some products to help. One of the big problems we discovered was roadworks. This will stop a visually impaired person going to the shops for 4 weeks. And in law in Britain, you know, you have to allow anybody coming along a road or footway from any direction to understand exactly what is happening to them. So we did more research. We took the existing products that are used by building contractors and we redesigned it completely. We put We designed better colour definition. These dimples allow for tactile comprehension. And we had QR codes that if you've got an iPhone, it will give you a visual message. It will give you a verbal message, or any smartphone. So you just hold it by the QR code, and it will say, you know, this barrier is 12 metres long. It'll be here till Tuesday, the 3rd of October, and the people to ring up to complain on British Gas on this number. And we tested it with users, and it's currently in development. So this is an example of the type of work we do. And this is, I love this photograph because this is in the Hockney Gallery of the Royal College of Art, where some fine art hangs, but we put in a pedestrian walkway for the visually impaired. Another project. So this is, we're very interested in ambulance design. The London ambulance is in a crowded city. They queue up outside hospitals. The average speed of an ambulance is 7 miles an hour, and there's all kinds of problems with ambulances. They're built on an ad hoc basis. They're very claustrophobic for the patient. They're hard to clean for the paramedics. They have every conceivable bit of stuff in there for any emergency. And you don't have 360-degree access to the patient. This is what one looks like. They also, whatever the emergency, however small, their modus operandi is to swoop and scoop. They pick up the patient, take them back to the hospital. We came up with a systems redesign in which we thought if we could make an ambulance which was a sterile field hospital, it was like a room that was sterile, that had all the right kit in it. You could treat somebody on the spot and discharge them from the ambulance if you had the right information and tools and environment, without taking them back to the hospital and clogging the place up. So we envisaged this, a 3-stage development process. Redesign the main ambulance, redesign small vehicles, and then have systems integration. So what I'm showing you here is the redesign of the main. Most ambulances in the UK are based on a Mercedes Sprinter box. So our research team did ride-outs. They went out on 12-hour shifts and saw all the emergencies and how people work. We built, out of cardboard in the Royal College of Art, the interior of the ambulance. When you strip everything out, it's quite a big space. We recruited a paramedic from the London Ambulance Service. Her name was Dixie Dean, and she came onto our design team as a designer to co-design this thing with us. And Dixie had a huge amount to say to our research associates, because she was the one with the experience of being on the road. We may want to design a lovely ambulance interior, but she knew how it worked. We did very detailed, what we called link analysis of, we studied how people moved around the existing ambulance, where they went, what equipment they needed, how they moved their body, how ergonomic it was. We did lots of studies. This was a research grant from the government. And the detail doesn't matter, it just shows you the depth into which we went, because these are very complex processes. And then we used our design skills as design researchers. We created a deck of cards to depict equipment and consumables and a board game. And we said to paramedics, rearrange the interior of the ambulance with the cards, put where you would like to see things. And this was really, really interesting. This is what some of the boards looked like. So they began to group things and say, well, you don't need to take that out on every trip, and you could group this with that. And it was using visualization techniques, using design techniques, design thinking. Clinicians have never thought in this way. And gradually, an ambulance took shape. And this ambulance had 360-degree access to the patient. And instead of wooden cupboards, we had injection molded plastic interiors, like a yacht interior, that you could just wipe down with a cloth to get rid of bacteria. It was much easier to clean. And And it had a digital diagnostic system inside the ambulance that prefigures a time when all patient records are electronic, so that you could race to an emergency and have up in the ambulance all the data you need. And then we got to the exciting bit. The team said we need to build a full-scale mock-up, and we're going to try and find an old ambulance on eBay. And I said you can only spend £450. And we bid for an Australian ambulance on eBay, and we got it for £437. And this was the ambulance. And then we had the problem of how do we refabricate it. And our vehicle design school at the RCA had done a lot of work with McLaren, the Formula One racing, you can't make this up, the Formula One racing team. And the fabricators for McLaren were a company called Dove. And we said, look, we have given you lots of really good, the professor at the RCA called Peter Stevens, if you know racing cars, he's designed lots of them. He said, you're going to do a pro bono piece of work for us. And so they built our ambulance. And this is the interior. You can see on the right a series of modular treatment packs. You only put in the treatment pack for the emergency that you're going to. You can see the digital screen. You can see the jump seat for relatives who hitherto had not been allowed in the ambulance. You can see the white, clean plastic walls and daylighting. They put windows in the ambulance to make it less intimidating, and we had 360-degree access to the patient. That's not me. But here you can see the digital diagnostic system and the modular packs. And then we began working with paramedics. And this is an actress who's simulating a leg ulcer, and they're working in a new space, and here they are checking the digital screen, because we designed, it doesn't exist yet, but we designed a kind of faking the future kind of digital communication screen. And then we did clinical evaluations, and we were working with this with a team at Imperial College, scientists, clinicians, emergency health practitioners. And we compared the old and the new. And we had a series of scenarios. One was infection control, and the other was cardiac arrest scenario. This is the digital diagnostic system. This is my colleague from Imperial, a doctor, emergency care doctor. And what he's doing, he's using an ultraviolet torch, checking for bacteria. And what came out of it is a set of data. And here we weren't afraid to evaluate what we'd done. So the new ambulance is the green, and the old ambulance is the yellow. And we did very, very well on contamination. The new ambulance is much cleaner. It also, considering it's an alien environment that paramedics haven't worked in before, they actually did a blood pressure check and did a wound dressing much quicker, because there was more space, things were where they needed it. What was interesting was there's a technical skills score for paramedics. Actually, we didn't score that highly, because I think that, they didn't quite understand the new ambulance. But the data was very, very encouraging, and we had lots of really good feedback. After dealing with the patient in the middle, I can't imagine doing it any other way. It's useful to have direct contact with hospitals, saves a lot of time, the idea of having this digital system. And the ambulance won a huge number. It won the Design Museum Design of the Year Award and IDSA Award and all kinds of awards. It's still not on the road. We're in a European development phase at the moment, because in a sense, this interior is running ahead of the system and the ability to change, to deal with all the protocol changes that would be required. So finally, I just want to show you briefly a project, another urban project, called Lighting Local Communities. And I noticed this in Prague, and all major cities have this issue. Cities suffer in part from light pollution, but light is never evenly and equitably distributed. So what you get is tourist areas which are overlit, like Piccadilly Circus, and then you get inner city housing estates where the poor people live, which are underlit. You get business districts which have offices burning light all night. Then you have suburban streets where the lighting is inadequate and parks aren't lit, so you can't use them after dark. So we wanted to look at outdoor lighting. We particularly wanted to look at underlit urban pockets of the city. Could we bring an inclusive design approach to actually redistributing light in a more equitable way? Very grand project. And we had two designers work on it, Megan, who's an architect, and Tom, who's an industrial designer. And they chose to look for an exemplar site. And in London, there's a place called the Boundary Estate. It's the oldest purpose-built housing estate in London. It was built on the site of a notorious slum. The slum was cleared, and at the centre they built what they called, it's called St Arnold's Circus. It's a bandstand in the centre, and this is how the housing estate looks. All roads lead. So this is the housing estate, and all roads lead to the this now neglected bandstand in the centre of the Boundary Estate. And what's interesting is that it's not well lit at night, and the only older people stay at home. Young mothers with kids don't like to go out on the estate, and it's a very mixed estate, and we got to know the estate very well over a 2-year period. There's 3 communities. There's a white working class community, there is a black Bengali community, immigrant community, and then there's a middle class white professional moving into the estate. And the 3 communities don't quite gel, and the area is very poorly lit. So we did a whole series of workshops, and we used drawing and visualization and mapping techniques. This is with young Bengali mothers, and we got them. We said, where would you like lights to be, and tell us about your neighbourhood, and very open questions, and best bagels in town, and we got them to draw where they would like lights and where they don't go and where they do go. We began to get a sense, and you can see the tensions coming out. And this, you see on this map, somebody's written, at the south of the estate, that's where the uber trendy middle class white community live. And at the top of the estate is smells of curry, ethnic foods, the Bangladeshi community. So the road running through the middle is actually dividing the community. And so we began to explore. We did a series of temporary light engagements. We did an LED balloon swap one night, which was very successful. We got different people in the community to come out after dark, just by lighting up little pockets of areas so they could see safely. The best guarantee of getting people to go out after dark is seeing other people there, and then they feel safe. So what we did was we organised these temporary light events, and I know you have quite a lot of light events in Prague, don't you? It's quite a growing urban thing. And we came up with a principle. We came up with a very simple principle. We called it Nighttime Neighbourhood Network. And these were some of the conceptual drawings done by the architect. We weren't literally proposing giant angle poisers, but the idea that there would be low-level lighting, a necklace of light across the estate, bus stops, seats, swings, and wherever you are, you could see another point of light and you move towards that light. So people could move from these very low energy, low volume, but reassuring pinpricks of light. And we showed it to the estate, and we showed it to the local authority, and we showed it to the police, who were very worried about the estate. They said it's a great idea in theory, but who's going to pay for it? And Tom, one day he went to the estate, he tied up his bike, and he looked around, and what did he see? Everywhere he saw tubular steel tubes. They were used to tie up the bike, the adventure playground, they were fences, they were railings, they were bollards, and the local authority said to us, yeah, we've got warehouses full of this stuff, it's really cheap. Every estate in England has got, it's got tube clamps and steel tubes. We've got miles of it, That's not a problem. We thought, interesting. And Tom had this eureka moment. He thought, what if we put lights inside the existing infrastructure? What if we found a way to put a light fitting inside a bike rack, a bollard, or a bench? And after trial and error, we worked with the manufacturer and we put an LED light inside. And of course, once you've got a light tube and you've got a library of tube clamps, you then have luminaires. And so we began to experiment on the estate. And at first, people said, oh, well, people would come up to us, and of course, we were using a battery, and there were wires, and there was a bit of the Hawthorne effect where people are affected by the experiment. And they said, oh, the light's too light, or what have you. But eventually, we began to experiment with colour temperature and positioning. And then our breakthrough moment, the police said, can you do something about this children's playground, which nobody plays in, because at 5 o'clock in England in November, it's pitch black, and people use it as a toilet or for drug deals, prostitution. So we befriended kids, and we designed, we gave them illuminated goalposts, which was a beautiful idea. It was a huge success, and they're now, because it was plugged into the mains, it wasn't like floodlighting a pitch, which would disturb the neighbours. It would just allow kids a pinprick of low energy, low volume, low cost light, and it's made that playground. Usable all around the year. It's been a huge success, and they're now rolling things out. So I've tried to show you with 3 case studies just at the end how we promote some of our values. These are difficult problems. They're not easy. The redistribution of light, emergency mobile healthcare, and safer streets. Their design is part of a complex socio-technical problem. But inclusive design is a way of thinking about these problems. My hour is up. Thank you very much indeed. I greatly appreciate your attention. Thank you.
Despite all the aging prognosis, I have to say that all these topics and modernist acting in these topics in Czech Republic are still missing so much. I would like to open a Q&A with first question.
Sure.
Is a British government used to cooperate with this kind of organization, or using design thinking methods, or did you have to persuade them or to cooperate with them?
I think the British government is improving because in Britain, with 65, 70 million people, we have an urgent need to redesign government services and public service delivery. So healthcare, education, transport, they're desperately thinking of new ideas. Design thinking is very current. There is now a policy unit in the Cabinet Office. So they are taking design seriously. But at the same time, they're removing money from the arts and humanities. So the Royal College of Art has had a huge cut in its funding budget from government. 5 years ago, there used to be the government paid for 2/3 of the costs of the Royal College. Now it's 1/3. So we have to work much more with charities and industry. So I wouldn't say the government in Britain is great. It's kind of interested in design thinking, but doesn't want to, like all governments, it doesn't want to pay for it.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Another question?
Yeah. Feel free to ask anything. Yeah.
Okay, my question, which I asked you already in the afternoon, but how do we? You have spoken about complex systems and healthcare and changes in healthcare. How do we can communicate these changes or these systems themselves to people?
It's very complex. The way that we're working now is design is polarizing. There's one group of designers who, in a complex world, they're saying, I'm going to do something very singular and creative and artistic. This is the expression of me. I'll make a bowl or a pot or an object or a dress or a piece of graphic design. And I think that's absolutely great. People standing outside the system. And then there are a group of designers who are working in the interdisciplinary space with scientists and engineers and clinicians and medics and so on. And that's when you come into, hospitals are incredibly complex places, in terms of the clinical effects. And design gets pushed down the list. But designers are very good at putting the person at the centre of the process. So the way for designers to have value within complex systems is to promote people, promote the user. Too many government services are not focused around the needs of the citizen, they're focused around the needs of the bureaucrat. Too many health services are focused around the need of the clinician and not the need of the patient, which may be very different. And design is a way of reorienting public services and complex systems towards the needs of the people who use those systems. That's how I would describe it, if that makes sense. Any more questions? Yeah?
How do you go about including practitioners in the process? And especially, not even practitioners, but the people who are older, disabled. How do you kind of engage them in the process so they believe in the in the process?
Right. Well, I think that the way to engage people is to come at them not from an expert mindset. So you go to a doctor, they're the expert, you're the patient. You go to a lawyer, they're the expert. You're just the dumb idiot who needs legal advice. And designers too have been guilty of professional kind of arrogance. I'm the architect, I'm going to tell you how your house is going to be, or how your office is going to be redesigned, or what have you. And it's having a participatory mindset, and we've always tried to not impose that on. You can't impose anything on RCA graduates, as I'm sure you can't impose anything on our academy graduates here, but we've tried to instill that value of participatory mindset. So you say to people, you don't observe older people using a power tool from behind those mirrored walls where you can see them and they can't see you. The traditional American Mad Men focus group, which is horrible. You're treating people as though they're guinea pigs, they're kind of, lab rats, and you're studying them. You sit in the room with them and you say, hey, what are your issues? Tell me about, especially older people, tell me about your life. Tomorrow, a group of students are going to be teamed up with 4 senior citizens in Prague. And you're going to be in groups of 4, and you're going to talk to them and be with them and maybe go on a shopping trip with them or something. And you're going to come up with a kind of ideas for new products and services based on that ethnographic encounter. And I think you'll find it a lot of fun. People are very surprising. So to answer your question, participatory mindset rather than an expert one, and assume that you don't know all the answers. You have more technical skill and more ability because you've trained as a designer. But you don't know all the answers, and people are very surprising.
I guess, just one following.
Yeah, sure.
How would you explain the process in an elevator pitch to an older person, because
I need your help.
I tried to explain this to my grand, and I've never succeeded. I've
Right.
tried 10 times already, and she just doesn't get it.
Yeah.
So.
I think a series, you know, what would you like to make your life better? You know, or be more specific. You know, what is it about this kitchen that you hate and would change? You know, there's a movement in Britain called Fixperts. Have a look online, fixperts.org, and it's like design students from all over Britain going into people's houses and fixing things for them, just using their design skills. And it's become a big movement. It's really interesting. There's a question here.
Yeah, how do you persuade companies to be involved? Because I can imagine they are used to develop their products and they are in a classical way, but sometimes the design is not very inclusive. So how to persuade them to use this inclusive design?
The pitch to companies is very different. You don't get moral. You don't go, we're making a better world. You don't go, you should do this, you know, equality, and you don't talk about the civil rights movement. And, you know, my presentation to companies is very different. You know, you talk about markets, and you talk about, you know, there was a big event in New York last year called Blue Sky Must Die, which was really interesting because it was all about companies have too much innovation. They've all got products then, they haven't got a market for it. And they've got too many ideas. They've had innovation mantra for years, and they've got too much, and they don't know what to choose. And the back end of the innovation process is working very well for companies. Excuse me. You know, they're generating lots of ideas, but it's the front end that they've cut back on, the ethnographic research. They've tended to hire social scientists who do an ethnographic study, write a report, and it goes onto a shelf. Or it gets put in the design studio of a company, and they go, what the hell's this? What we've tried to do is say, look, our pitch to companies is we will do the front end, and we will identify the problem, the issues, and we will then take it through into a creative design process and give you some exemplars, and then your design team can latch onto these and pick it up. You know, so we create that missing link between social scientists, you know, writing a report and it going on a shelf. We go through over that hump, and that's our pitch to companies. We'll let you get closer to your customers. And you know, there's a big, you know, especially with things like the VW scandal and you know, everywhere you look, you know, institutions, especially corporate institutions, especially international athletic institutions, people are skeptical, people are cynical, and you know, they need ways of reconnecting. They need to understand, you know, the traditional marketing segmentation of how consumers are put into boxes according to socio-economic category. All that's out the window. It's a complete load of bullshit. You know, we need new ways of understanding people. You know, if you were to analyse me, you know, I'm 60 years old. What category am I? You know, in some aspects of my life, I'm incredibly experiential. In other aspects of my life, depending on the mode, I'm incredibly conservative because I'm not a young guy. You know, but you know, I don't fit any traditional marketing category, and I don't think any of you will either. So people have got to understand people in a new way, and they've got to read how people live. We do ethnographic studies in people's homes, and we've shown them to companies, and they've gone, my God, we've never seen anything like that. You know, and also being an academic institution, you can get, people will open their doors to you. It's a big opportunity for the academy here. People are much more willing to share and let you in if you're an educational institution than if you're some kind of nasty, tax-avoiding, rapacious corporation. Yes, it's a different pitch. More questions?
Yeah. Aren't they sometimes overwilling? You know, they get too much exciting, they are telling you something which might misguide you somewhere else.
Yeah. I think you're not going to, just because you have an ethnographic encounter with a user group, whether it's a group of Bengali women on a housing estate or a group of paramedics in London, they're not going to tell you the gospel truth and you write it down and then, hey, we've got a design. The stuff they'll tell you things which are contrary to how they really behave. They will tell you contradictory things. They will tell you the wrong things. It's your job as a designer to marry up what they tell you with what you're observing, what precedents are. And the reason we chose practicing designers, RCA graduates, to join the centre is because there's a point, and some people in the inclusive design movement disagree with me fundamentally, but I believe there's a point where the designer has to take over. There is a point where the designer has to design, the designer has to decide, the designer has to act and use their professional skill and training and heightened sensibility around form and order and arrangement of elements. You have to do that as designers. So, yes, you're quite right. You know, users can confuse the hell out of you, and but often, you know, you only need, you know, it's called the sample of one. You only need one user to tell you one great idea, and you act on it, and that's enough. You don't need 1,000 people to tell it to you. You know, there's a famous story about Paul Smith, the fashion designer, and he was walking through Covent Garden one day, and he saw a bloke in a grey suit, and inside he'd stitched a huge piece of pink satin. He was obviously a guy who had an office job, but was on the inside was really kind of, you know, quite fashionable. And he saw this flash of pink satin on this grey day in London, and then he did a suit, you know, it was pinstripe and it had a bright purple interior, and he got it from watching one guy who'd done a kind of mock-up. So I wish you all the very best of luck with your studies, professional practice. Thanks very much for coming.
Thank you very much.